All right. Well, Christian, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to start off to learn a little bit more about your story. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I say story, I mean, who are you, right? That's the age old philosophical question. And what do you really care about? What gives you a sense of meaning in life? Could you share a little bit about some of these things so that we can get to know you a little bit better?
Those are very big questions, or small, depending on how you see it. But I grew up on a tiny island that's south of Sweden. Um, and until I was 16 or 17 and went to college. So most of my life, I lived in a very small community with, um, my childhood was in a very small community in around 50,000 people. And in the little town I grew up in was 8,000 people. So very, very small. There was a couple of schools and a library and a mayor. It was just a little place. And I really wanted to get out of there. Uh, not not that I didn't like being there, but it was just attractive to go somewhere else. And then I moved to Copenhagen, which is the main city in Denmark, of course. And I lived I lived for a while in London, where I studied. And I worked as a journalist there for a while, which was just a reason. Well, it was a way of making a living, but it was also just a way of getting to meet some of the people I wanted to meet and ask the questions that I wanted to. And, at that point, well, I just took advantage of it and got to meet sort of heroes of mine, which was very important. And then I went back to Denmark and I started a couple of companies. I mostly did that because I had to make a living somehow, and other options didn't feel very good. So the academic world felt unhappy and sleepy. It was not sort of high energy enough for me. Then the media world, the world of journalism and writing, felt as if it was falling off a cliff. So there was always somebody that lost their job. It was always sort of people were fearful of the future, and sort of very defensive, which was completely understandable. So and then I ended up just starting a consultancy. At that point, I didn't have any capital, and venture capital was just, I didn't know what that was. So it could have been many things, but it just ended up being a professional services firm, because that's a way quickly to make enough money to pay people and so on, have an office and so on. And then after a while, my wife wanted to get out of Denmark. She's from Pakistan and a Muslim, and Denmark at that point was kind of rather hostile to that. So she just wanted to get out of there, and we went to New York, and because that sounded fun. And then I opened an office in New York, which is sort of vast difference from the little world I grew up in to this major city that just felt endless and rich, in the sense of what people you could meet and what music you could go see, listen to, and the kind of people you would meet in an elevator were different than the one. We didn't have any elevators in the entire time, so it was just a different experience. And I've been living here for more than a decade now. Yeah. So that's
Wow.
sort of my upbringing, or simple sort of story of where I come from.
Yeah, I think it's a long journey and a pretty adventurous journey. It seems like that you've been on, starting from a small town in Sweden to then going to Copenhagen, then studying in London, going down the path of journalism, meeting some of your heroes, exploring who you are and also like what these people are up to. And then finally starting a consulting firm, first in Copenhagen and then in New York City, right? Vastly different worlds, two different worlds almost. Before we dive into more about a little bit of consulting and your approach to that, I'm a little bit curious about the heroes that you said you went out to meet and what that experience was like, because I feel like the people who I consider heroes tell a story about me as well. So I'm curious to know what's meaningful to you. This was a big part of your book, right? What do you care about? What's meaningful to you, right? Humans care, machines don't care. So I'm curious to know, what do you care about? And if you could describe some of these heroes that you met and what did you learn from these experiences meeting your heroes in London?
Right. Well, so I had many, and many of them played football, but just one that comes to mind is a sociologist called Scott Lash. He was sort of, I suppose, part of the 1990s sociology crowd around London School of Economics. He was at Goldsmiths, I think, but there was this crowd which was around Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck and other sociologists whose main idea was, no, they had many ideas, but one of the ideas was reflexivity. This idea that we react to, well, the way you say it, there's been a discussion about actors and structures forever in sociology. Is it the structure that defines us and our behavior, which would be like Karl Marx would say that, or many others, or is it the actor, the individual, that makes decisions about what we do, which would be more like Schumpeter or Max Weber or someone like that. And they solved this problem by saying it's both. That the structure in, let's say, in New York City of the bus system in New York City or London or anywhere has a structure to it where you can't get on the bus except if you stand at the bus stop. And if you stand in the middle of between two bus stops in London, it's different in different places in the world, but let's say in London, then you won't get on the bus. So in that sense, the structure defines how you can get on and off the system. But if nobody ever stands at a bus stop, or if there's a place in the city where suddenly a lot of people move to that need a bus, then the structure changes. So there's this sort of interaction between structure and actor that I think they call structuration. It's a long time ago since I read it, but he was very important for me to meet. And I mean, it's a long story, and I don't know if we have time for it, but if you grew up like I did in the 80s in a place like Denmark, then we would have nuclear bomb drills every week, where you were just fearful that the world would end. We would also there would be a lot of talk about climate change even back then, and there would be a lot of talk about sort of the hole in the ozone layer, and thankfully we fixed that. But there was this sort of feeling of the end of the world, and he then described that as sort of living post-apocalyptic lives, that we sort of live after the apocalypse, because it feels like it's inevitable. And I think a lot of people, young people today, would say, that's the feeling we have as well. So he sort of described an emotion, I suppose, a way of living where it's after the world went down. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm kind of an optimist in many ways, and I think humans can fix many things, and I think we'll fix things like climate change. You have to believe that, and I think there are good reasons for believing that. But it was just an emotionally important moment to meet him, and sort of great honor, and I'm just in complete awe of him as a sort of a thoughtful guy.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So let me see, I understand what exactly you're saying. When you met some of these heroes of yours, one of the primary ideas that sort of has been stuck with you is this idea of reflexivity, which essentially is trying to, let me see if I understand this correct, but this sort of dynamic nature between the actor and the structure, right? Or human beings within a sort of context or structural system that shapes the human being. And in some way, I was sort of thinking of this as this whole argument between free will versus determinism, that as actors, are we in free will and control, and do we create our own lives having this internal locus of control? Or is it that the world, that the structures and all these events that have happened before I have arrived in this moment that define what I will do? And it seems like it's neither this or that, but rather this and that, that this nature of this, the relationship is more dynamic. It's not binary, and it's both at the same time, is how I sort of understand this. And then to, yes, go ahead.
No, just an example would be the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, if some economists describe the stock market, they would describe it as rational and having its own life, and its own direction. And what they're saying here is no, that's humans expecting what others' expectations are. And so we would expect that cryptocurrency would go up, and therefore we would invest in cryptocurrency. And that dynamic between somebody saying that the structure has its own life and direction, which would what Karl Marx would say, that we would eventually end up logically in a particular society. That's not true. It happens between people, and it's a reflective sort of loop of people interpreting each other's behavior. So the stock market would be one example. Another one would be technologists that say technology will lead us to a destination that we already know, like the singularity, or there are ideas like that, where the Anthony Giddens and Scott Lash and others, as I remember it, a while back, but they would say, well, that depends on how we interpret it and what kind of interaction happens between structure and actor. So that was thoughtful, I thought, and it sort of took down a lot of the myths of the things that was dominating when I grew up, which was, Karl Marx was pretty important, and where the future was determined. And this is, individual lives was structured by something that had a direction, and you couldn't do anything about, which feels bonkers in a way. So
Yeah, almost sort of disempowering, right? To like remove this agency. We can argue whether it's an illusion of free will or actually free will, but this locus of control that we can sort of internalize and have, and believe that we can sort of control our own lives and have some choice, can be empowering. But that's a whole other debate. I'm very interested in a couple of things you brought up, because I'm actually taking a class on this. I'm taking a class on tech, nature, and values, or actually I should say nature, tech, and values, because my professor always says nature comes first. And you sort of proposed this notion about climate change and all these sort of disasters we're having, and also the technological changes that are happening in our society, right? With the bomb drills that you said, bombs are clearly technologies, or the stock market, or cryptocurrency, right? Or the singularity, all these technologies that are interacting with us and with nature, and sort of creating this effect that now we call the Anthropocene. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, given that I recently read Martin Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology, an extremely dense piece, but sort of on these lines of, there's this destining of technology, that it's going in a certain direction, but he sort of warns us against the dangers of technology. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on technology, how you conceptualize it, what the essence of it is, and how does that interact with nature and the sort of like disasters that we're creating in today's world.
That's a ton of things, of which I don't know much. But if we start with that essay, it's a good essay. And it was written in the 70s. No, wait, earlier than that.
1954.
1950, that's incredible, like how
Right.
early he saw that. And his examples of technology were how water was harvested as a source of energy on the Rhine River, like very, very, and airplanes, and things like that, where today we're talking about, deep learning or pretty advanced, different technologies. But already then he saw that technology had a different, he says that it has nothing to do with technology. He calls it technicity. So it's a way of us seeing ourselves and seeing he calls it being. So technicity, or technology, let's call it that, is a way that we look at ourselves. And the word he describes, it's a German word, which is Gestell, and it basically means a standing reserve. So we see the Rhine River as a standing reserve of energy. We see the woods, not as God's creation or as something that has a sacredness to it. It's just a pile of wood that we can use to build things. So we see the woods or the river as a resource. And his concern is that, and that's different from before. That might have been different from 1,000 years ago during the, or in some places in the world. But he then says that's something, that idea of seeing ourselves as resources, seeing the nature as resources, but also ends up seeing ourselves as resources and seeing each other as resources that are flexible, harvestable, always available to us. And of course, I mean, in big companies, we talk about human resources, right? So we see ourselves and others as flexible, interchangeable pieces of resource in a way. And he says that's when you start seeing yourself as resources, you end up in a place where God is gone. And by God, he doesn't mean the God of Abraham. He means the magic of the world, or the sense that something is more than just resources. Let's say it that way. That's not completely precise, but so that essay describes maybe what human resources are today, where you look at people, the language in companies is that people are full-time equivalents.
Mm-hmm.
Or they say headcount. That's another word for it, right? Where we look at each other as resources that are available to be optimized. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you end up in a dark spot. And he ends up saying only a God can help us. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't mean the return of the Bible or the Torah or something like that. He means as the main center of being. He means more than just seeing each other as resources. And it's unclear what he really means, and he ends up being, he's almost like he almost is like a pagan kind of I don't know. He sees moments where the gods arrive, mm-hmm. As as an agreeable thing. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredible essay and kind of dark.
Yes, exactly. And very, very dense and confusing, sort of leaving people in an ambiguous space to reconcile for ourselves. But to sort of tie in a couple of these ideas, you spoke about how Heidegger sort of mentions that we have started to see the world in a very objective sense and looking at them as standing reserves, basically resources to be able to harness and exploit and like create new value out of. And then we think that, oh, we are creators, we are creating this. But there's another essay that I recently read by Barry Wendell called Two Economies. It's a fantastic read, a short essay, where he says that no, we don't actually create any of this. We are not creating value, right? In economics and our modern day society, we say we are generating value. No, we're simply converting value. We're simply restructuring the value that nature or God or whatever we want to call it has created. And Barry Wendell sort of brings about this idea that there are two economies. One economy is our little economy, our industrial sort of economy that is limited by our own human perception. And then there is the kingdom of God, or the greater economy, where everything is accounted for. And that's sort of the godly notion that we have sort of become ignorant towards. And hence, because of our ignorance and our sort of loss of perception, or maybe looking at things in our own little worlds and bubbles in an objective way, has made us lose touch with all these things and almost in touch with ourselves, right? He's sort of talking about how technology is revealing to us our own essence as human beings and how we're sort of losing our own way. Now, I'm wondering, how do you reconcile this, given that, you know, you work in a space where you're dealing with organizations and a structure that is based on these values of capitalism and of looking at things as resources. I mean, even the language, I think, looking at the linguistics of it completely changes the way we look at it. And the more I'm sort of fed with this knowledge of, you know, this is the way this is an employee, not a human being. That is two completely different people, right? This is a colleague, not a friend or a human being. Completely changes the relationship we have with our own reality, with our own structures, with our own sort of the people around us. So how do you sort of reconcile this tension of being in a structural system that is fueled by capitalism and certain ways of seeing that encourages us to look at everything as resources to be capitalized and exploited and create value out of? And yet it's this sort of little economy that we're, you know, like bubbling off in and thinking that we're great and we're gods and we're doing all these great things. But really, it seems like we're destroying a lot of things. So how do we sort of, my question is, how do we reconcile that tension that at least I feel, given that I am in a business school and yet thinking about these things?
Right. Wendell Berry is a interesting person, and he has a view on farming, particularly, right, and food, that is very sort of farmers market, sort of Alice Water kind of look at it, where you could say, well, we need mass scale industrial agriculture in order to feed the amount of people we are in the world, and there's a, you know, there's a discussion there. So Wendell Berry, although beautiful and has a sort of a back to the land kind of attitude, it's also a little too hippie for me in some ways. So that's just that. But on the other hand, you know, the little island I grew up on was the main source of income was cod fishery. So basically fishermen going out harvesting enormous amounts of cod from the Baltic Sea. And then I think in 1982, it was banned overnight. So because it was overfished radically. So it was very palpable that my friends, particularly, I mean, mainly fathers, lost their jobs. And then because they were out at sea harvesting cod. And so the connection to nature was quite real. And you could sort of see the world as many layers of ancient technologies, like growing and harvesting grain and cereal, and then on top of that sewage systems, and on top of that, you know, building systems and so on. And we just live in this top, you know, on top of all that, in the, you know, not everywhere in the world, but in, let's say, in New York City, and discuss deep learning, which is absurd if the, you know, if it's just the carpet is pulled under your the rug is pulled under your feet. Like at least what I saw when I grew up, that the relationship to nature is pretty real, and when it collapses, it's dramatic and heartbreaking. So I suppose that's not really an answer, but I don't know what I think about it.
Do you think we can coexist? I mean, one side there's Wendell, who's, like you said, a little bit too hippie, I guess, a little impractical given the scale of things. And on the other side, we have perhaps capitalistic notions of like, let's just scale this. Who cares? Let's just look at these as resources and exploit it and scale it and whatnot. Do you think that these two sort of notions or ways of thinking can coexist and that we can create a balance? Because both have their pros and cons, right? Like capitalism does enable us to exchange and trade and create new information and recreate value, or sort of change value and meet our needs, essentially our human needs. But at the same time, there are certain negative externalities and trade-offs to it. So the question that I often grapple with is, how can we sort of create a world where we can minimize these negative externalities? Perhaps how can we expand our perceptions of our economy to go from this little economy to connecting with the greater economy? I mean, sometimes I think the answer is big data, collect more information about more things that are happening. If drilling the earth is, creating certain externalities, then measure those externalities and ask these people to pay for it. If we can measure the truth, although like that's a whole other concept, and maybe we can never measure or know the truth, but collect more information and data, and then use that data to create a bigger economy, not such a small little like economy that is in our own world, ignoring the externalities and continuing to create this damage. What if we could use perhaps technology and data to be able to expand our economy and create a coexistence within these sort of contrary views of seeing? And I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, because you sort of in your book speak about how we need human intelligence in a world of big data. So sort of bringing about the dangers of big data, or like how that's not the only answer. So I'm wondering, how do you see the sort of answer or path moving forward?
I mean, it's easy to, and very popular today, to knock on capitalism. And it's a very easy answer to say the reason why we're nervous about our relationship to the environment, let's say, is because of that. But on the other hand, I mean, it's pretty clear that it pulled more than 1 billion people out of poverty the last 20 years. So it's a little bit easy to sit in New York City and have abstract conversations about capitalism as a structure when clearly global trade has been quite helpful to a lot of people. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in any of this. But big data. Well, we don't call it that anymore, do we? I mean, it was sort of fashionable for 10 years to talk about big data. A little bit old-fashioned now. Now it has different words, but it's the same idea that if we just get enough information, we can make a model of the world that gives us full transparency to what's going on, and we can predict the future. And I think right now we're hopefully at the end of a virus situation in the world that I wonder if big data predicted. Right? I mean, and it didn't predict that, and it couldn't predict any of the things that happened. And I think many of the companies that I was involved in the last 2 years, they said we spent, hundreds of millions or sometimes billions of dollars on big data systems. And now that we're in chaos, in a very difficult situations where we don't know how to invest and where to invest, or pull back or hire people or fire people, where is big data now? We need it when we need it. And that doesn't mean gathering information is wrong. Information is wrong. That doesn't mean algorithms that can get us predictions we can interpret is wrong at all. I'm actually a huge fan of it. But on the other hand, as the only one, as the only input, I've seen that where the trust in at technology, it becomes so high that people lose their minds and start thinking that they can make a perfect model of the future. And it just strikes me, if you go back to reflexivity, that's untrue. We can't predict the stock market. At least people have tried, but I think it's fair to say that that's difficult. Um, and maybe it's not happened yet. So I suppose, I'm not against data. I'm a huge fan of the experiments that are happening. I think it's exciting. What's going on. I think unsupervised learning is one of the most exciting things I've learned about for a long time, or heard about, and try to be interested in. But thinking it's the only model and it'll explain everything, that's just ridiculous. And it's a misunderstanding of us, who we are, how we react to things, how our world makes sense to us, and how meaning gets infused in our lives, or is there already. So it was just the hubris of it and the hyperbole around it that annoyed me. And then, of course, for me, because I teach in a school in New York that has a heavy focus on the humanities, and because I like historians and art historians and find literary criticism and so on. It's just a preference I have. At that point 5 years ago, and maybe it's better or worse now, but at the point when I wrote the last book, it was bad in the sense that people that were interested in art history, kids that were interested in studying art history or comparative literature or music, were discouraged by their parents to do so, because if they studied computer science, they could get a job quicker, or they needed an MBA in order to get a job in the future. And that was too bad, because I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true that if you study philosophy or something like that you'll end up broke and homeless. I think you can use it for tons of things, and it's an incredibly practical tool in the everyday. And I just saw the history departments empty, and the funding go away, and the best students that could have studied philosophy end up against their will and against their best interest and against their, what they find interesting in life, ended up studying computer science or something like that they didn't want to. And it's, that's not great for them. It's not great for all of us that, history departments are falling apart, because we better study history, don't we? So there was just this sort of negative attitude to the humanities and parts of the social sciences like anthropology or sociology or something like that I thought was incredibly stupid and annoying. And I just wanted to write a book about that's untrue and not great for anyone.
I could certainly see your annoyance and feel your frustration in the book, especially with the criticism of Silicon Valley or certain firms like IDEO and like their kinds of ways of doing, which can be sort of, I'll not say much about it, but I want to get to the point of juxtaposing the humanities and, on the other hand, what people call more practical sort of studies like business and technology. It's weird you bring this up, like this point of history, because just yesterday in one of my classes, I was interacting with the new person, and he was extremely like motivated about, completely profit driven, and wanted to like become an investment banker and all these sorts of things. And then when I asked him, what are you really passionate about, man? He said, man, like I used to be a history and politics nerd. I love history. But given my circumstances, the structures, going back to reflexivity, I know it's not practical. I can't go down that path. And I've sort of like forgotten about it. I need to, if I want to live a stable life, if I want to live a good life, I need to go down the path of, investment banking or finance or business. And that's where I think the way is to go. And that's where even my parents think. And given my circumstances, I must do this. If I become a historian, like there's no job I'm going to get. It's going to pay me like $10,000, $20,000. And there's no chance that it's going to be valued. So given these notions that still exist about the humanities, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the value of humanities in the context of business and technology, and what people usually consider to be practical things that create progress in society, and how these things are, just like soft and fuzzy things that don't matter. Could you share from your practical, like your own experiences, why they do matter?
Right. You operate at a big scale, like like very, very high in the sky. Um, well, I think it's too bad for him. And I don't think it's true, but I get it. If you go to university, and you, in America in particular, I mean, where it's so expensive, it's unattainable. And particularly if you have to pay it yourself, then you end up in deep debt. So I absolutely get it. And I come from, of course, a country where education is paid for and by the state or through taxation, which I very much support, that you have a taxation system so that people can um, have access to education and healthcare and so on. But so I think it's too bad for him. And I think if you want to go into investment banking, I don't think history is unreasonable. I think actually his history can inform a lot of things in investment banking. Um, that yeah. So I would hope that he would still be interested in history and be inert about that. Um, I don't think there's anything wrong in learning how to financial modeling work and so on. But I just wish people would follow their interests a little more, because I think if you do that, you get depth and you have energy about it, and you can use it for many things. And I think some of the best investors in history studied philosophy or history or art history. Some of the biggest CEOs, some of the, if you want to talk money, like the highest earners in the world, they actually, have a liberal arts background. So I don't think this very functional view of education is very good, but it comes out of a broken business model of paying $60,000 for, for an education. It's unbelievable. Um, so I get it. I understand, but it's too bad.
Yeah, and the education system is something I love to speak about. I'm super passionate about, but yeah, that's a whole other conversation for another day. But the point that I learned from this is that the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, that are shaped by the stories that we tell ourselves in the world, right? These memes that spread through the world, that create culture, and these sort of notions that we go down are super important, right? I recently read Daniel Dennett, who spoke about consciousness being explained, where he said words and stories are to human beings similar to what webs are to spiders, or what dams are to beavers, right? Stories are what create us. We simply tell stories. That's like the most natural thing. And I believe that, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I'd like to bring out stories that give a new way of seeing things, because that's when we'll start to see a possibility of how things possibly could be in a different way, a new narrative for our own lives. And I found that extremely powerful for me when I read your book and your article, especially. And I'm wondering if you could share the story specifically of the anthropologist walks into a bar. What do you see, and how did you apply anthropology as a sort of social science in this context of a bar trying to solve a business problem? Could you share that story with us?
Yeah, it's a long time ago. And that article is what, 8 years old or something like that. It's an old article, but I think the title grabs people because it has the name bar in it, which is of course exciting. I think we need to go to bars right now, but I'm not an anthropologist, and but I like ethnography, which is a tool developed primarily by anthropologists, which is observation of people. and observation in the context they're in. So it's not extracting data about how many steps they moved or where their GPS is or what they uploaded on Facebook. It's observation of them of us in context. And in this particular case, it's a very large brewery that I was asked to look at their relationship to bars. And of course, they sell their product there. And we just looked at that. We looked at what it's like to run a bar. What's it like to, or a pub, because a lot of this was in England. What's it like to do that? And of course, there are pub chains and there, and so on. But most of the pubs have an owner that have their identity invested in that bar or that pub, and that have people come, and often the same people, and so on. It's an important thing in any culture, really, that there are these, watering holes, let's call it that. So there's so much identity involved and so much beauty, really, in these places and what they mean for our communities. Yet this beer company that we looked at, or this brewery, they thought that if they just took it, that the way to sell more of their product was to advertise, and to advertise was to take their logo and their corporate identity and just splash it everywhere, so that their names would be in front and center of everything. And if you think about that, somebody that runs a bar, builds, has that as a livelihood, have these people coming in just covering their place up in their logo is annoying. So what we found was all this stuff that they make, and in this case, I think it was 80 million euros, 100 million euros worth of stuff that they used in England alone that they made. So that umbrellas and T-shirts and banners and all kinds of things that they then give the bars in order to convince them that they should sell more of their stuff. It ends up in the basement. Nobody wants it. So we thought that, the advice we gave was, how about not doing that? How about cutting that? So reducing the cost of doing this, because it's against the bar owner. It's ineffective because it ends in the basement. All the sales reps that drive around and are supposed to give these T-shirts and umbrellas and crap to the bars just end up throwing it out because they know it doesn't work. So it was just this, by looking at bars and looking at pubs and looking how that whole world works, we could see that the way they approached it was not only ridiculous, but counterproductive. So by cutting cost, we could increase the likelihood of people in the bars liking this company, and therefore buying their stuff, presenting their stuff to customers. So it was really a cost reduction exercise, but ended up as that. It was not the beginning of it, but it ended up as that. And it all came from just looking at normal people doing normal things in these community places that bars and pubs are. So it had a business problem at its heart, right? How do you approach your market? But the source of information came through spending, a lot of time with owners of and users of, or regulars of bars and pubs. So I think that was the idea of the story, that innovation can be informed by ethnographic practices, and innovation doesn't have to be adding things. It doesn't have to be designing new things. It might as well be just not doing things and reducing things. Not necessarily just for the sake of cutting costs, but for the sake of improving relationships between a company and its market. I think it's a long time ago, but that's how I remember it.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And one thing that really stood out to me in the process that you used was the field of phenomenology, and how you reframed a business problem as a phenomenon. I found that extremely fascinating because, studying at a business school, the first thing we're told is I look for problems and see them as opportunities. And that usually leads down to parts where like now we're just coming up with random ideas, trying to just increase it in any way we can without really getting to the essence or core of it. And it seems like by reframing the way you sort of used language completely changed the way you were observing, is what I'm guessing. So I'm wondering what makes you say that we should reframe problems as phenomenons, and how can one actually do this? Because a lot of people listening to this are business students thinking about starting new entrepreneurial endeavors, looking for problems to solve. And why would you say we can perhaps restructure this as phenomenons, and how can we do that?
I mean, the idea of problem solving is, of course, at the heart of modern management consulting, and therefore MBA classes and so on. But if you look at, and there are a lot of problems to be solved, by the way, and I'm a big fan of that kind of analysis in some situations. But it assumes that there are errors that we can correct, right? That there's a problem that we can solve, which is that there are errors in the way a company does something, or in the way a product category works, or in the way a service work. But what if it's not an error? How about we assume that we can add to the understanding of these important interactions between us and markets, and rather than always looking at things from an error correction kind of point of view, which is kind of a negative view of the world. I mean, I'm so impressed by some of these companies that what they can make. I mean, it's incredible. And assuming that that they're doing things wrong is a way for consultants to to sell products to people, to make them to sell their service to people, to point out problems rather than maybe look at phenomena. And that's the way I do it. It's not the only way, but it's one way. And that is, instead of looking at decision making between two products, or between a product and a price, you look at what's the phenomenon in the first place. So that would be, what's it like to run a bar? Instead of looking at how do we sell more TVs, what's a TV's role in a family, and how is media consumption changing? That's a human way of looking at it. Instead of thinking about how one cancer medication is bought and sold to doctors that then prescribe it to people, then look at what's it like to live with cancer? What's it like to be told that you have cancer? What's it like to be around someone that you love that was told that they have cancer? And what's it like to be a doctor giving that message to people? Is that a clinical thing? Is that a cynical thing? Is it something you just learn to live with? Or, and so on. And you can learn a lot about what that's like as a human. And therefore you could design new things that are, or add, subtract, take things away, that's based on the human experience of it. And phenomenology is the study of human experience. And ethnography is one way of getting that. Statistics is another. Big data is a third, and so on. There are many ways you could do this, but it's trying to understand what a human phenomenon is, how to describe it the best you can based on whatever information you can gather. And that's a good start. Because I think insight is the driver of innovation, rather than just problem solving. I think true human insight is a great way of developing a business, or anything really, rather than always looking at it as errors.
What you just said really energizes me, because it aligns a lot with my philosophy that I've been sort of trying to embody, of not seeing things in a binary. when we see things as good and bad, right and wrong, error, and whatever the opposite solution, perhaps, we start to like see the world in a very structural way, or maybe that's not the right word, but perhaps what Heidegger was trying to say, like see things as resources or see things as problems to be fixed. And when we're trying to fix everything, it seems like it's having a externality, right? I'm not sure if you've seen that game in these video game places where you hit one thing and something else pops up, and then you hit that and then something else pops up. It seems like this problem solving method usually ends up to do that. And when we ask questions that just say, how can we increase this? Somewhere underlying that is an assumption that increasing that is the way to go. Whereas maybe it's not. Maybe we need to step back and see it from a non-binary perspective and not see everything as a problem to be fixed, including ourselves. I mean, the whole notion of utopia is kind of coming from that no, utopia is not one day. Right now is bad, and one day we'll have a good, perfect world is not the way to go. It's to realize that not everything is bad, that the nature is in the way that it is for a certain reason. And that if we can have this sort of non-binary way of looking at things, then somewhere we're developing empathy to be able to get to the core of our own human experience and how we experience things. And then once we do that, we start to uncover and reveal insights that we previously were unable to see. And then once that happens, perhaps we could apply that in a more sort of framework, binary way of thinking. But what I'm hearing from you is to go beyond the binary and get to the essence, to empathize and look at the relationship that people have in certain contexts, in certain activities, and then based on that, make whatever decisions that we are trying to do in a business context.
Yeah.
Would you say that's exact what you're trying to say?
Maybe. Maybe it is. I mean, there are problems, right? If you go to East Baltimore or Northern Ethiopia right now, there are problems to be solved, and maybe some of the things we're talking about now are luxurious, you could imagine, but I don't know. I've just found that insight and understanding often comes through this suspending judgment and trying to just look and listen, like shut up and just look and listen. Where I think a lot of some of the education coming out of business schools are a little more confident than that, and sort of come with a set of assumptions to a problem that as if they know, right? So I think there's some sort of, I suppose, epistemological humility that is helpful and frankly effective. It just takes a different attitude and a little at a different kind of time, but also fun. I mean, it's fun to try to understand the world. If you make cars every day or computers every day, wouldn't it be nice to understand mobility and computing? From a sort of what role it plays in people's life beyond the platitudes and the simple answers. I think that's a way I enjoy looking at the world, and it's not the only one, but it's one way of looking at it.
Yeah. I really appreciate this way of looking at things, and it sort of reinforces my own passion for studying the social sciences and trying to understand why are things the way they are, and then using that in context to solve like some dire problems and complexity, right? Reconciling that. Now, I am a fan of social sciences and humanities, and I'm not sure if those words are interchangeable, but I also came across certain like counter arguments to this that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on, because it connects to exactly what you were saying in your book. So the essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes on Twitter that the opposite of education is not ignorance. It is education in social sciences. So the question that I thought was, well, is he trying to say that social science is leading to ignorance, or that essentially like social science isn't really a science? He was trying to get to the epistemological ways that we're trying to know, like trying to figure out how do we know what we know, and having this sense that, social sciences are not really a science, because the way I understand it from my own humble readings of it is that anything that's social leads to groupthink because it's based on consensus. Whereas individuals, perhaps scientists, right, physicists, chemists, or whatnot, are searching for truth, right, not for consensus. And so that's what I understood as the reason for why Taleb and many other people have been like sort of criticizing social sciences. But on the other hand, I saw your sort of notion in your book about culture and not individuals, right, which sort of is antithetical to what the previous argument that I just made. And that you said in one of the previous podcasts that you're interested more in cultures rather than in individuals. So how do you sort of reconcile these two, the thesis and antithesis, and sort of maybe come to a synthesis within this?
Right. I'm a huge fan of his. I mean, I think he's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. That doesn't mean I agree with everything, but I think you could read it in two ways. You could read it as if the world can be described with mathematics, and almost look as our lives as physics, right? Which I think is one way of looking at it, but I don't think that's necessarily the whole picture. I think what he believes about, I think what he says, and I'm putting words in his mouth now, might be that the social sciences have left big parts of the social sciences have left the ideal of trying to understand the truth about something. That there's a postmodern streak, or a postmodern, maybe even Marxist-inspired sort of attitude in some parts of the social sciences that already assume that the world is built in a particular way of, capitalism and oppressors versus oppressed, and the logic that Marxism is about, and that parts of the postmodern movement have been inspired by, let's say it that way. And I think I think he's annoyed by that. So I don't think I wouldn't think that social sciences is against what he believes in. I think he might even find it inspiring if it's done with the attitude of trying to understand rather than conclude before you even start looking. And I think that's pervasive in the social sciences, and I think that's why people are annoyed by it. I think that's why people get away from it, and why I think lots of the social sciences have painted itself into a corner where nobody listens. I've heard that, I don't know if it's true, but I heard that the average anthropology paper is read by less than one person, after it's published. And that's maybe something to think about. And I think that's what he means, is it's generally irrelevant what's happening in some of these sociology departments. That doesn't mean social science is wrong. It just means that it's carried out in a way that's ridiculous. So that's probably, I don't know, I would hope that's what he means. I know he's just a great mathematician, and some mathematicians believe that the social world and human meaning can be described formularically the way that you can describe the laws of nature. I think that's fundamentally untrue.
Mm-hmm.
You can try, and it's one input, but thinking that humans can be described the same way as atoms or bacteria can be described, I think is fundamentally wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say that this connects to one of the other principles you laid down in your book of thin data versus thick data, where yes, this sort of Popperian view of pure science view of using mathematics to explicate and like keep breaking things down can bring us to one level, but there's a whole other ocean beneath that has been not yet discovered. And perhaps rather than explicating, when we can enter the world of implicating and looking at it from this more human perspective of what comes out from within, perhaps things can start to change. And I do feel very hopeful to hear these things, because these are certain things I'm passionate about. So it adds to my own bias that these things are great and I should continue going down this path. But in any case, the last thing that we love to ask all our guests on our podcast is, what is your utopia? What does that look like? Maybe it could be today, maybe it could be one day. But given that we've covered and dabbled with a lot of different concepts, going from reflexivity to technology and the questions concerning technology and the way we sort of perceive things as standing reserves and resources and the world of business versus sort of other notions of that you maybe a little bit more hippie of just going back to the nature and to our roots. And then looking at the social sciences, the humanities, and its role in solving business problems. All that being said, I'm wondering, what does your utopia look like?
I mean, there's a whole political story that I won't get into because I'm not a relevant person to ask, other than I'm just a normal voter. But for me, what I hope is that people would start more, that observation of each other becomes a stronger practice, and that we train people in and use rather than dismiss by saying that there are models that describe everything. And that means slowing down, and suspending judgment rather than having ready-made opinions for everything. So I suppose utopia would be a little slower and a little less opinionated and loud, and maybe more about listening and looking rather than opining and pontificating. That would be good. And I think it's something you can teach and learn, and we know how to do it. Humans know how to do it. We just maybe get overwhelmed by our surroundings and the input we get. So we end up passing along easy answers and believing in simple models of the world when it's actually rich and beautiful and magical. So I think utopia would be a little slower.
Christian, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and a vision of your utopia. It's something that I definitely believe in. This is a notion I've been trying to practice, to just slow down every day rather than always being on time. I try to be in time and flow and just slow down. And it seems to be very, very helpful to me. Sort of counterintuitively, it helps me actually become more fast when I'm trying to be on time and be productive. So I love this notion, and yeah, my gratitude and thank you for sharing everything you shared today.
Thank you so much, and encourage your co-students to follow their interests and the areas that they want to go deep in.
Yeah,
I think that'd be good for them.
I completely agree, and that's one of my purposes in life, is to build communities and create spaces where people can explore their inner innate curiosity and passions and just follow their sort of heart in that sense, and to be able to find this coexistence of these contraries that we're often thrown by from society. So that is my goal. And yeah, I really thank you for illuminating light over some of these areas that I wasn't clear on, and I'm sure a lot of listeners hadn't thought about or sort of were struggling with. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you too. Stay warm in the
I will.
Good.